Every single state in the US has had at least one serial killer, if not multiple, and that's a horrifying reality. Today, I'm going to tell you guys about the most notorious serial killer in Texas, and he not only was a horrible dude, he also had multiple accomplices, so we're going to talk about them as well. And Texas has been a state that you guys have been requesting for quite some time, and this is probably going to be the longest video I've ever uploaded. This is the longest story I think I've ever told, so if you've got cleaning, if you've got work to do, buckle up, get ready, start cleaning, because we're going to be here for a while. Texas has a lot going on. There are multiple serial killers. This one was especially horrific, especially because, like I said, he had accomplices. There's multiple people doing his work for him. Like, he was a really terrible guy. And so I'm going to tell you guys today about Dean Corll. And he was creepily dubbed the Candyman long before he even was a serial killer. Like, people in his town, the children were calling him the Candyman. And that just seems like an alarming thing to be letting the children in your community call a grown man. So I don't know, that already is weird, but let's just get right into everything about him. So Dean was born December 24th of 1939 in Indiana, and he was the oldest child. He had a younger brother, and his father was super strict. His mom was very protective. There's this juxtaposition of like being held really accountable, but also getting a lot of things excused. It was just kind of like a weird combo for parents. And because their parents were very different, they fought a ton, and they ended up getting divorced in 1946. And so Dean would have been around 7 years old at this point. In 1950, about 4 years later, they did try to reconcile their marriage and they all moved to Texas together, but they ended up splitting up again. And during this whole time, Dean was a quiet child. He was very serious. He didn't really play much with his peers. He didn't really seem that interested in getting to know his peers or anything like that, but he cared a lot about if people rejected him, which is really interesting. So he had no problem rejecting other people, but he did not like to be told no himself. He really could not handle any criticism, rejection, or being told no at all. After his parents split up a second time, his mom ended up remarrying, and her and her new husband had a daughter together. And then they also started a small family business together, and this was a candy shop. And they ended up starting it in their garage. And pretty much right away, Dean and his younger brother were expected to work at the candy shop constantly. They had to go to school, come home, and immediately work for their parents. So they were very busy. They were held to a very high standard with this business. By 1958, Dean graduated high school, and him and his family relocated to Houston. And this is because there's a better location for their candy shop. And they ended up opening up a storefront, and they called it the Pecan Prince. After this, he helped out with the store a little bit, but then he ended up moving around a little bit, kind of doing some stuff on his own for a few years. And then in 1962, so about 4 years later, he moved into an apartment above the candy shop. In 1963, his mom got divorced again to her second husband, and she started her own candy business this time, and she called it the Corll Candy Company. She made Dean the vice president of that company, so now he was in a leadership role. He was very important to this candy shop. He was there all the time, running it, doing all sorts of stuff for their business. The year that he was made vice president and she opened this business, one of their teenage employees actually came forward and complained to the mother that Dean had essayed him. And instead of dealing with this or trying to find out if Dean had done anything to harm this child, she ended up firing the teenager. And so really there's no sort of accountability for Dean. He wasn't held accountable for any of his actions. He got to do whatever he wanted, and his mom just made excuses for him, which is not a good thing to do. And obviously a huge problem if he is actually essaying children, which we will find out he definitely was doing. In 1964, so he's about 20 now, he ends up joining the army, and he apparently did pretty well in the army. Like, it seemed like he was fine, but he did not like it. He ends up applying for a hardship discharge, and he says it's because his family needed help with their business, and he ends up getting honorably discharged. And we now know that during his time in the army is when Dean realized that he was gay. He didn't come out to his parents or his family or anything like that, but he knew at this point that he was gay. Multiple of his friends and family said afterwards that once he came back from the army, there's a really big difference in how he acted towards other men, but specifically how he acted towards teenage boys. It sounds like before he left, he was pretty closeted. He wouldn't show if he was interested in anyone. When he came back, he would definitely show more interest, but the problem is that he's showing interest in teenage boys, which is gross and awful. But for whatever reason, it didn't seem to be that concerning to people because he still is working at this candy company. He's now being called the Candyman by all the kids in the town. He works a ton. He's always there, and he especially loved to give candy and special attention to the teenage boys and the younger boys in the area. It's pretty common for teenagers to group together and try to find places to hang out after school and stuff like that, and this candy shop ended up being one of those places. A lot of the teenage boys after school would come to the candy shop because this guy was giving them free candy, he was hanging out with them, chatting with them, and then he actually made a hangout spot in the candy shop. So he had access to a ton of very vulnerable young boys and young men. In 1967, Dean ended up meeting one of those boys who would hang out at the candy shop. His name was David Owen Brooks. An emphasis on boy, he was only 12 years old when Dean met him. By the way, Dean is now 27. And Dean would often give candy and money and gifts to all the kids, but he started to pay special attention to David, and he started to groom him, essentially. And by 1969, the relationship turned I don't really like saying relationship because that sounds like it's a two-way street. And even if Dean thought he wanted something at the time, he was 14. So he was not actually consenting to a relationship the way that an adult could. So I don't really like saying the term relationship. And Dean would give David money or shower him in gifts in exchange for acts. And the next year, so when David is 15, his parents end up getting divorced and they live in different cities. And so David would go back and forth between his houses. And whenever he visited his dad in Houston, he would actually stay with Dean instead of his dad. And why the father was letting his 15-year-old son live with a 28-year-old man, couldn't tell you. And clearly David should have had someone step in and be like, what is going on here? But no one did. And so David is now living with this guy who has groomed him and assaulted him for the past 3 years. Obviously, the essay continued throughout this whole time that he's living with Dean. So now we're going to go to 1970. And on September 25th, an 18-year-old freshman in college named Jeffrey Conan vanished while hitchhiking with another student on the way home. And he was going from his university to his parents' house. So he and another boy are hitchhiking, and they both get picked up by a fellow classmate. The one boy was dropped off in the uptown area of Houston, and then Jeffrey was never seen again. And we now know that Jeffrey was killed by Dean. He was asphyxiated and strangled, and when his body was eventually found, he had a cloth gag around his mouth. And Dean buried Jeffrey's naked body on a High Island beach in Texas. His body wasn't found for like 3 years, and no one had any suspicion that Dean had done this at the time. It just seemed like he had just vanished. No one was suspecting Dean. But we know that this was Dean's first murder. And if you remember, I said that the boys were picked up by another student, according to the other boy that was dropped off in the middle of Houston. So obviously, Dean was not the one that picked them up. We actually learned that David was the one that picked them up, lured them to Dean, and essentially brought Jeffrey to Dean to kill. So Dean used David to lure and kidnap Jeffrey for him. And I doubt that David knew that Dean was killing Jeffrey, but he definitely knew that Dean was going to do something to him. Soon after Dean gets David to help lure Jeffrey to him, David, who is obviously still living with him, he walks in on Dean actively essaying 2 teenage boys that he had tied to his bed. And Dean was worried David might say something, so Dean offered to buy David a car in exchange for his silence on this whole thing. And David was probably pretty hesitant, but he agrees. Again, he is a victim in this relationship. He is emotionally involved with Dean. He probably is wanting to do whatever he can to keep Dean happy. And so he agrees, and so Dean buys him a green Chevrolet. A little while later, he ended up admitting to David that he had killed the 2 boys that he was essaying, and then he told David that he would give him $200, which is about $1,600 in today's money, for any boy he could lure back to Dean's apartment for him. And so on December 13th of 1960, David was able to lure 2 teenage boys to Dean's apartment in exchange for money. The boys were named James Glass and Danny Yates. James was an acquaintance of David's already, so David was kind of able to be like, hey buddy, let's go hang out like at my friend's house. And then once he got them there, Dean essayed them, and then he also strangled and killed them and then buried them in a boat shed that he had rented. And keep in mind, as I'm telling you these stories, that Dean often would make his victims call their parents and be like, hey mom, I'm staying at a friend's house, or I'm gonna go on a trip or whatever. And he often would make these kids call to kind of cover his tracks and make it seem like there was a reason that they went missing and not just that they disappeared one day. And so Dean unfortunately was very smart in the way that he was trying to cover his tracks when he was harming all of these boys. 6 weeks after he murdered James and Danny, they struck again. David and Dean approached 2 boys named Donald and Jerry Waldrop. They were brothers. They were both teenagers, and they were walking back towards their parents' home at the time. They saw them, approached them, and asked if they wanted to hang out. Once they got them to Dean's apartment, Dean essayed, strangled, and he buried them in the boat shed as well. That same year, between March and May, so we're in 1971 by the way, Dean ended up abducting and killing 3 more victims. They all lived in the Houston Heights area, and he buried all 3 of them in the boat shed. And David helped lure all 3 of them to Dean as well. Their names were Randall Harvey. He was 15 years old. He was last seen on March 9th. The next was David Hillegeist, and he was 13 years old. And then Gregory Malley Winkle, who was 16. And Gregory and David were abducted together at the same time in the afternoon of May 29th. And they were essayed and murdered at the same time as well. Again, Dean is trying to cover his tracks. He's having these kids try to call their parents and give some fake reason that they are going missing or like they're running away or whatever lie he was making these kids tell their parents to try to get the parents to stop looking for their kids. However, many of the parents, obviously once their kids went missing and they hadn't heard from them in a while, were looking for their children. And at this point still no one was suspecting Dean in the slightest. And so there was many different families handing out posters. Again, this is all kind of happening in the same area. So there's multiple different people looking for their missing children at this point. And I don't think anyone had put together that this was potentially a serial killer. I think because a lot of the boys had called their parents and given reasons, I don't think anyone had really connected them or thought that this was all done by the same person yet. They all thought they were individual disappearances, but obviously most of the families were looking for their children at this point. And Dean is probably feeling the pressure of this, so he very often would move apartments to try to make sure that he was not getting caught. David Hillegeist's family was one of the families that started putting up posters and looking for him, and actually one of his childhood best friends ended up helping their family put up posters when he went missing. And this kid's name was Elmer Wayne Henley, and he was 15. And he had been a lifelong friend of David Hillegeist, and so when he went missing, he was committed to trying to find David, and he was convinced there's probably a pretty innocent reason why David had gone missing. On July 1st of 1971, a 17-year-old named Donald Falcon disappeared from the streets near his parents' house, and his body was not discovered until they found out about everything Dean had been doing, so many years later. And we know he was one of Dean's victims because they recovered different sections of his body near the boat shed as well. 7 weeks later, on August 17th, David and Dean once again were looking for another victim for Dean. And they met up with someone that David knew personally. He was a 17-year-old named Reuben Watson Haney. He was walking home from the movie theaters. And David ended up persuading Reuben to come hang out with him. He said that Dean was having a fun party at his apartment and he should totally come hang out. And Reuben believed him, and so he says, okay, yeah, let's go party, gets in the car with them, goes to the apartment, and is ultimately essayed and killed as well. In September of 1971, Dean ended up moving to another apartment, and we now know, based off of David's confession from years later, that he says that he helped Dean abduct and murder 2 more teenagers during the time that he lived at this apartment. We do not know their identities. They both remain unknown to this day. I don't know that they ever were able to fully confirm that Dean even killed these kids, but because David confessed, it does seem pretty likely. Sometime in October of 1971, David ended up meeting Elmer Wayne Henley, that 15-year-old who was helping hand out posters looking for his lifelong friend who had gone missing because Dean had killed him as well. And Dean had had his eye on Elmer, and so he told David to go get him, essentially, as another victim. But when David was able to lure him back to Dean's apartment, Dean ended up deciding that instead of being one of his victims, he actually wanted to make him one of his accomplices. And it sounds like some people called him Wayne, some people called him Elmer. I'm just going to call him Elmer for the sake of the story, but if you look up this case, you might see him referred to as Wayne. So Dean ended up offering him the same thing that he'd been offering David. He said that he would give him $200 for any kid he could lure back to his apartment. And Elmer was not under the same grasp that David had been. He didn't have some sort of relationship. He wasn't living with him. He hadn't been groomed by him for years. And so he ended up declining and saying, like, no way. But he never went and reported this either. He just brushed it off and ignored him. Dean didn't tell him that he was going to be killing these boys. He told him that he was involved in a white slavery ring and that he needed these boys to be essentially kidnapped, and then he was going to sell them into the slavery ring. And again, Elmer said no, but he didn't report it or really seem that concerned about it. And apparently Dean offered for months and months and months. And for a while, Elmer just kept saying no. Eventually, Elmer and his family needed money, and so he said okay. And so he decided to help Dean. He agreed to lure boys back to Dean's home because he thought he was into some sort of slavery ring and he was just going to be selling these boys. So we don't know exactly the details of the first victim that Elmer helped him find. Elmer ended up confessing later to this, but we don't know exactly who the boy was or when it would have been. But sometime in 1972, Elmer helped lure a boy to Dean. He lured him by offering him some pot back at Dean's place. And then once they were back at Dean's place, Elmer watched Dean bind and gag him, and then he ended up leaving, so he didn't see what Dean did for the rest of the time. He thought he went and sold him into the slavery ring, but in reality, Dean kept up with his typical MO. He essayed, strangled, and murdered the boy. To this day, we still don't know who this victim would have been. All we really know about it is what Elmer confessed. But Elmer didn't even know the boy's identity. 1 month later, on March 24th of 1972, Elmer, David, and Dean all end up going and meeting up with one of Elmer's friends. He was an 18-year-old named Frank Aguirre, and he was walking home from a restaurant that he had worked at. Elmer ended up calling him over to Dean's van, and he said that they were going to go smoke some pot, and he asked if he wanted to come. And he ends up going over to Dean's house, and he ended up smoking some pot before picking up a pair of handcuffs that Dean had had on the table that he had used on previous victims. And when he picked these up, Dean ended up jumping on him, pushing him into the table, and cuffing his hands behind his back. And Elmer said that at the time he had no idea of what Dean had planned for this boy. And he says that when this all happened and he realized that Dean was going to assault and kill him, he tried to ask Dean not to, but Dean ignored him and ended up essaying and murdering Frank as well. We know that Dean also tortured him, and it sounds like he tortured multiple of his victims, and as he gets more victims, the torture just gets worse and worse and more brutal. And even though he was shocked by the fact that he was not just abducting them for a slavery ring, he still ended up helping Dean with future victims. On April 20th, Elmer helped Dean and David abduct another kid. He was a 17-year-old named Mark Scott, and he knew Dean pretty well. So they end up abducting him by force, and he fought like pretty hard to get away, but Dean ended up restraining him. And while he was restrained, this kid actually tried to stab Dean with a knife after like hours and hours of abuse and torture. And this includes like Dean burning him with incense. But unfortunately, this kid was not able to get away. At one point, he kind of broke free, but he saw Elmer pointing a pistol towards him. And according to David, he says that in this moment, he saw Mark just give up. He saw his friend pointing a gun at him after being tortured for hours and realized there's no getting out of this, and that his so-called friend was the one that set this up. He ultimately suffered the same thing that many of his other victims did. He was essayed, tortured, strangled, and then buried at High Island Beach. When David was giving his confessions later on, he said that Elmer was especially sadistic in his participation of many of the murders, and Elmer later admitted to becoming fascinated with how much stamina people have, so he loved the idea of seeing how long people could last with torture. And so at first this had been something that Elmer was not wanting to get involved in, but once he had an end to harming people, he became very fascinated with it and enjoyed it a lot. Whereas David, it seems like he didn't really enjoy it. He just did it because this is what he was being told to do, which doesn't make it any more right. And both boys are still victims in this, even though they're accomplices. They are also both young, they were groomed, and they are both victims of Dean's as well. But they still also are accomplices and murderers as well. On June 22nd, Elmer helped them abduct and murder 2 more boys. Their names were Billy Balch and Johnny DeLome. Elmer had invited them to Dean's apartment where they were just kind of hanging out, and then he ended up helping Dean subdue the pair and like attack them. And Dean had tied both boys to his bed, and he had tortured and essayed them. And afterwards, Elmer actually got involved and manually strangled Billy himself. And the process of strangling him lasted almost 30 minutes. After he had strangled Billy, apparently Elmer then shouted, "Hey Johnny," and shot Johnny in the head, and the bullet ended up exiting through his ear, and he didn't die from this, and he started pleading. He shouted, "Wayne, please don't," before Elmer ended up strangling him. And this is when Elmer became very active in the murdering aspect and not just the abducting aspect of these crimes. Soon after, the trio ended up luring a 19-year-old named William Rittinger to the house. William was tied up to the hooks that they had drilled into the wall of the property, and then also a plywood board, and this ended up being their torture board. This is what they would use to tie up multiple of his victims so that Dean could torture them for hours on end. For whatever reason though, in this particular case, David was trying to get Dean to allow William to be released. I don't really know why. It doesn't seem like David ever says why Dean let him go, but Dean agrees and he lets William go. But a little while later, because of this, William ends up knocking David unconscious as he enters into Dean's house one day. And Dean ends up tying David to the plywood boards and assaults him repeatedly before he releases him, and says that this was because he had wanted him to let William go. Because he didn't get to hurt William, he was going to hurt David instead as punishment. And even though he just endured this assault and torture, David ended up continuing to help Dean with the abduction of his victims in the future. Dean ended up moving apartments soon after this. Again, he's moved multiple apartments at this point to be undetected. He ended up killing 2 more victims at this apartment. He killed a 17-year-old named Steven Sickman, and he was last seen leaving a party on July 19th. And he was bludgeoned in the chest with a blunt instrument before he was strangled and buried in the boat shed that he had been burying many of the other victims at. And then about a month later, on August 21st, he killed 19-year-old Roy Bunton, who was abducted by the boys and Dean. He was gagged and bound with adhesive tape, and then he was shot twice in the head and buried in the boat shed. On October 3rd of 1972, David and Elmer ran into 2 different teenagers. They were named Wally J. Simono, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing his name wrong, and Richard Hembry. And they were walking towards Richard's home together when David and Elmer drove up in David's Corvette. It's a green Corvette. It looks super cool, and the boys were super into it. And so they used that as a way to entice the boys to get in, and then they drove them to Dean's house. This is one of the cases where Dean made the boys call their families, but in this particular case, when Wally called his family, all his mother heard was him shouting the word "mama" into the receiver before the connection was ended. And then we know that the following morning, Richard was shot in the mouth, and then they both were strangled to death. The next month in November, 18-year-old Willard Branch disappeared while he was hitchhiking from Mount Pleasant to Houston. He had been found gagged and emasculated. On November 11th, a 19-year-old boy named Richard Kempner disappeared on the way to a phone booth to make a call, and Richard was strangled and buried on High Island Beach. On January 20th of 1973, Dean moved to another new apartment, and within 2 weeks of moving, he killed 17-year-old Joseph Lyles. He had gone to Dean's apartment also to buy some pot. This was not the first time he had been at Dean's place, and it's kind of interesting that no one has really connected Dean to all of these disappearances at this point, because many of the boys knew Dean, or they knew David or Elmer, and people knew that David lived with Dean and that Elmer hung out with them a lot. So it's interesting that no one had made the connection at this point. In 1973, Dean ended up suffering from some health issues, and from February 3rd to June 4th, we don't think they took any victims. But also, Elmer ended up traveling to Florida with his uncle, who was a trucker, and so he was gone for a little bit, and so this might have been the reason that there was a lull in killings. But in June, when Dean ended up becoming a little bit healthier again and Elmer came back, they started killing again, and the rate in which they killed at this point increased drastically. David and Elmer both said that the brutality and violence level after this point just increased to a whole new level, and it was an insane amount of brutality at each of these crimes. And they both said that Dean would get to a point where they knew they needed to go get him another victim because he was getting so bad. He'd get mean, he'd get violent, and they were saying that every time they go get him a victim, he would calm down for a while, he'd be more normal. And so it was like he was a ticking time bomb, and after a while they were like, oh, we have to go get him someone else to calm him back down. On June 4th, Dean and Elmer abducted 15-year-old William Ray Lawrence. He endured 3 days of abuse and torture before being strangled, and then they buried him at a new location at Lake Sam Rayburn. A little less than 2 weeks later, Raymond Stanley Blackburn, who was 20 years old, was abducted, strangled, and then buried at the same location. And on July 6th, Elmer ended up going to a driving school and taking some classes there, and this is where he met 15-year-old Homer Luis Garcia. And the following day, Homer ended up calling his mom and being like, hey, I'm gonna spend the night with a friend that I just met at class. The next thing we know, Homer was shot and left to bleed to death in Dean's bathtub before they buried him at Lake Sam Rayburn as well. And then 5 days later, so again, their timeline has gotten even shorter. Dean and Elmer are rapidly escalating at this point. And so on July 12th, they killed John Sellers, who was 17. He was bound and then shot to death and buried at High Island Beach. And David at this point actually had a fiance. How he was able to maintain a normal relationship with someone else while doing all of this for Dean, I have no idea. But he had a fiance and she was actually pregnant. And for a while, he ended up actually stepping back and stopping helping Dean. And I don't know how Dean let him do this because it seems like Dean needs so much control. So I don't know how that all happened. I would have assumed Dean would have made him continue. But somehow David was able to kind of take a step back while his fiance was pregnant. So for a while, it was just Elmer and Dean working together. Between July 19th and July 25th, Dean and Elmer abducted and murdered 3 more boys. They were 15-year-old Michael Bouch, and if that last name sounds familiar, it's because previously his brother, Billy Bouch, was also a victim of Dean's, and he just didn't know. He was strangled and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. This poor family lost both of their children. Both their boys go missing, and they have no idea why or how. The other 2 victims during this time were Charles Cobble and Marty Ray Jones. They were abducted at the same time on July 25th, and Elmer says that he buried both boys' bodies by himself at the boat shed, which normally Dean was involved in burying the bodies as well. So it sounds like at this point he was starting to give Elmer more freedom and choice to do what he wanted. And again, Elmer is also devolving and escalating with Dean. On August 3rd of 1973, Dean killed who we know to be his last murder victim. He was a 13-year-old from South Houston. His name was James Drymala, and James was abducted while riding his bike in Pasadena, and Dean grabbed him and brought him back to his house, and he made him call his parents and tell them that he was at a party. And after he called his family and told them this, Dean ended up torturing, essaying, and killing this kid with a cord before burying him in the boat shed. And again, to our knowledge, this was the last person that he murdered. 4 days later, on August 7th, Elmer ended up inviting a 20-year-old named Timothy Cordell Curley to attend a party at Dean's place. And Timothy was supposed to be the next victim, and David was still not present at this time. And so Timothy, the next target, and Elmer came over to Dean's house. They were huffing paint fumes, drinking a bunch, and kind of partying. And at one point, for whatever reason, Elmer said he wanted to leave with Timothy, and he promised they would be back. Dean let them go, and so Elmer and Timothy ended up driving back to Houston Heights. They ended up parking their car close to Elmer's home. So for whatever reason, Elmer had wanted to take Timothy to his home. I don't know why. And while they were there, they ended up hearing crying, and they see one of Elmer's friends. Her name was Rhonda Louise Williams. She was 15 years old. She was kind of limping, and it turns out she had sprained her ankle. She was running away from home because her drunk father had beaten her that evening, and so she was trying to get away. So Elmer ends up saying, Rhonda, why don't you come with us? We'll take you back to Dean's place. And he genuinely meant that he was looking out for Rhonda. He had no intentions of harming her or having Dean harm her when he brought her back. It seems like none of them had any interest in harming girls at this point. So Elmer, Timothy, and Rhonda end up driving back to Dean's place. They arrived back there around 3 a.m. on the morning of August 8th. And Dean is pissed. He is screaming at Elmer, saying that he ruined everything by bringing a girl here. He is so enraged, asking what was he thinking. But Elmer tells him the situation. He says that she was being beat by her drunk father. And finally, Dean calms down and says, okay, whatever, and offers them drinks, drugs, and tries to get them super high. At some point, Elmer ended up passing out or falling asleep, and they ended up all passing out. A little while later, Elmer woke up and found himself lying on his stomach while Dean was putting handcuffs on him. And his mouth was taped shut and his ankles were bound together, and he looked to his side and saw that Timothy and Rhonda were also bound and gagged. When Elmer woke up, Dean ended up removing the gag from his mouth and yelling at him again about bringing a girl back to their home, saying he ruined everything. And then he starts shouting, I'm gonna kill you, but first I'm gonna have my fun. And then he starts repeatedly kicking Rhonda in the chest and shouting, wake up, and then calling her a bunch of names. After hurting Rhonda a bunch, he lifted Elmer up to his feet and dragged him to the kitchen and placed a .22 caliber pistol to his stomach and said he was going to shoot him. Elmer ended up being able to calm Dean down and saying like he promises to participate and he wants to harm not only Timothy but Rhonda as well. And he's like, let me free, I want to help you, I didn't ruin anything, like let me make this up to you, let me make this right, we'll kill them together. And so Dean ends up believing him and he lets Elmer go. Dean and Elmer end up tying both of them to the bed and their torture board that they had, and he ends up handing Elmer a hunting knife and ordering him to cut away Rhonda's clothes. And Dean says he is going to essay and kill Timothy, and Elmer needs to do the same to Rhonda. And when he says this, he starts to harm Timothy after putting that he had down on the bedside table. Elmer starts to cut away at Rhonda's clothes, and this is when Rhonda, who is awake at this point, leans in and says, is this for real? And this is when Elmer whispers yes, and Rhonda says, are you going to do anything about it? And remember that Rhonda and Elmer were friends. It wasn't just some random girl that he was helping. So as Dean is doing stuff to Timothy and torturing this kid, Elmer ends up taking the opportunity to grab the... He says, you've gone far enough, Dean, and then he yells, I can't go on any longer. I can't have you kill all of my friends. And Dean kind of seems to laugh at this, like he doesn't think that Elmer's going to do anything, and he starts yelling, kill me, Wayne, and starts like walking towards him, kind of like egging him on. And so he starts shouting like, you won't do it, you won't do it, and approaching Elmer, and Elmer is stepping backwards. You can see that he is panicking, and as Dean gets closer and starts to jump at Elmer to try to grab gun, Elmer shoots Dean. He actually shot Dean in the head, but it didn't end up going through his skull, so Dean is still alive at this point and continues to run at Elmer. Now he's like enraged, and so he ends up shooting Dean 2 more times. And at this point, Dean turns and starts to run, and Elmer shoots him 3 more times in the back and ultimately kills him. After Elmer shot Dean and killed him, he and Timothy began to cry as Timothy thanked him for saving his life. And Rhonda actually told Elmer that he should leave and run so he doesn't get in trouble with the police. But Timothy said, no, we should call the police. And Elmer ended up agreeing, and he wanted to turn himself in. And so at 8:24 a.m. on August 8th of 1973, Elmer called the police, and he said, y'all better come right now. I just killed a man. And then he gave them the address. And when police arrived, Timothy, Rhonda, and Elmer were all sitting outside of the home waiting for them. Police remember that when they pulled up, both Rhonda and Timothy seemed really emotional and they were crying, and then they saw one other kid, who it turns out to be Elmer, staring numbly off into space, and he seemed less emotional and like he didn't really care at all. We also learned from Timothy that Elmer at one point said, if you wasn't my friend, I would have gotten $200 for you. As Elmer was being arrested, he started yelling, I don't care who knows about it, I have to get all of this off of my chest. And then eventually he starts to confess. So he initially was questioned about the death of Dean, and he recounted pretty much everything that had happened about Timothy and Rhonda. And then he ended up confessing about being involved in multiple different deaths of multiple different boys over the past 3 years. And at first, the police don't really believe him. They think he might be lying. They don't really believe that Dean did all of this. But the details that Elmer had and the names that they are listing off, they are like, these are missing boys that we've been looking for quite some time. And so they start to believe Elmer. So they end up going and looking at Dean's home after Elmer tells them everything. And at his home, they find nylon rope, they find the plywood torture board. They find multiple different restraints and torture devices, as well as rolls of clear plastic, hunting knives, other weapons, 8 different pairs of handcuffs, a number of different toys, rope, and a bunch of other things that were used either for torture or the murder of all of these boys. They also looked at Dean's van, and they found tons of stuff that gave the same idea that Dean had essayed, tortured, and killed multiple people in the van as well. Elmer ended up agreeing to help police find Dean's boat shed and led them to the bodies of several of the victims. Once they started digging at this spot, they uncovered multiple bodies of boys they didn't even know had gone missing at this point. In the boat shed, they also found a stolen Chevrolet Camaro, a child's bike, a large iron drum, water containers, 2 sacks of lime, which was used to help decompose the bodies when he buried them. They found shovels, rakes, large plastic bags full of teenage boys' clothing, and so much more, and they were horrified at everything they were seeing. They end up digging, and they start to find a bunch of bodies at the boat shed. At the end of the first day, by 11:55 p.m., they find 8 bodies. At the same time, David ends up coming into the police department and turning himself in. And he ends up saying that he didn't know anything about the murders and he definitely didn't participate in any of them. He did say that he knew that Dean had essayed and killed 2 teenagers in 1970, but he said that he didn't know anything else at the time. But the next day, Elmer gave a written confession and listed off how much David had been involved, and actually said that David had been involved long before Elmer was. And eventually, David ended up confessing that he had been involved too. Elmer helped murder multiple people. David says he never actually helped murder anyone. He only helped with the abductions, which is still horrible, but he says he never killed anyone directly by his hand. Police ended up finding 9 additional bodies at the boat shed, so that's 17 in total at the boat shed. And then they also found 4 separate arm bones that didn't match any of the victims that they identified, so that means that there was even more victims that they found. After David ended up confessing, he also said he would take the police to High Island Beach and showed them where a lot of the bodies were there. And then Elmer ended up taking police to Lake Sam Rayburn, where the other bodies that they had buried there were found. In total, they ended up finding 27 different bodies, and we know now that Dean had at least 28 murder victims. And at the time in American history, this was the worst killing spree ever. It took them a while to be able to identify all of the boys and the bodies that they had found, and to this day, there's actually one that has not ever been identified. There is a photo of what they think he would have looked like, and the FBI and police still ask that if anyone recognizes him or has any information that they come forward. But in total, there was 28 boys that he killed, and he had multiple other essay victims. And again, Dean and Elmer were victims of Dean's as well. They obviously are also horrible people, but they were victims of his as well. Elmer was not charged with the death of Dean because they said that he had committed that in self-defense, but he was charged for 6 other murders, and he was ordered to serve 6 99-year sentences consecutively. He did try to have a retrial, but was convicted again of all 6 murders and again convicted to 6 99-year terms. And he is still alive today, and he's serving out his life sentences at Mark Stiles Unit in Jefferson County, Texas. He will be eligible for parole again in October of this year, unfortunately. David was serving a life sentence as well, but he ended up dying of COVID-19 related complications back in 2020 at age 65. We know that Dean and his accomplices killed at least 28 people, maybe even more. Most of what we know is from the confessions of Elmer and David. So if they were lying, if they were leaving things out, or if there were things that Dean did without them that they don't know about, then we would just have no idea that those things happened or that there might be more victims out there. It did take a while for them to identify all the victims. Like I said, it does sound like there is still one that has been unidentified. And some of the other victims that we now know who they are weren't identified until closer to 2010 or later in the 2000s. The unidentified victim that I told you guys about was the 16th body found at the boat shed. He was found wearing red, white, and blue striped swimming trunks, cowboy boots, a leather bracelet, and a khaki colored t-shirt. Dean Corll was one of the most notorious serial killers in Texas, and it's insane that he had multiple different accomplices that helped him out and lied for him for so long. The fact that so many people in his community let him have unchecked access to so many teenage and young boys is crazy. I don't know why no one was concerned by the fact that David was living with him. That's disgusting. And so I feel like the police, the community, so many different people let these boys down. Dean should have been caught long before he was, obviously, not only because he was doing so many horrible things, but also because the community totally should have seen this coming. Dean was a horrible, horrible person.